Joe Vukov, welcome to the podcast.
Dave Story, it's good to see you, man. It's been a long time.
Yeah. Joe and I were just talking before we hit record, and it's been about a decade
Been about a
since
decade. We overlapped at Fordham for about 3 or 4 years there.
since we cut our teeth
We
uh,
did.
in the Bronx together.
That's right.
Um, so you just came out with a new book, Staying Human in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. It's a very timely book. It's extremely timely for me. You make some allusions in the book to, the challenges that generative AI poses for educators. And, I just got an email from our dean a couple weeks ago, about how we should have a statement in our syllabus about our policy around this kind of stuff. And, I have no idea what I'm going to write. So hopefully you can give me some ideas
Well,
by the end
I,
of.
I'm glad I'm not the only one in the same boat because I'm very much in the same place that the administrators, I think at all of our universities right now, not just the administrators, the teachers too, is we're all really kind of wondering what to do as the new semester. Now we've had a little bit of time to think about all this, presumably. But at the same time, if we're going to put a statement in our syllabus, what exactly does that look like? I don't have the answer for you, but I've got, I think, maybe a helpful way to start thinking about it. Is that I think one way not to think about, I think we can start out thinking about the syllabus statement. I think that is a helpful place to start thinking, not thinking about it as an all or nothing policy about AI generally. And the reason I say that is because an analogy here might be helpful to putting something in your syllabus that says something along the lines of the use of the internet is not permitted or is fully permitted in this classroom. If you're reading that, you think, well, what does that even mean? The internet? The internet is kind of everywhere and in all things in some ways at this point. So what would it mean not to or to purposefully engage with the internet in the class? Same thing is becoming rapidly true for AI too, right? So I think that in the education space, we've been wringing our hands a lot about chat GPT, and for good reason. It's a sort of tool that can write you a whole essay comparing and contrasting utilitarianism to deontology in 30 seconds flat or less than that, right? So it churns out
And as you
solid.
point out in the text, B level quality.
Yeah, it's not A level quality stuff, but it's passable and it's an essay liked object, and it's really good at doing that. But I think before we sort of pounce on that and say, okay, my solution is I'm not going to allow AI in my classroom, we haven't paused to think about, well, what about grammar checkers? Things like Grammarly, things like even a thesaurus tool and a word processor. These things are AI or AI adjacent as well. And there's the sorts of things that pragmatically are impossible to track. But also, I think realistically, they're the sorts of things that are becoming more and more not only of our students' work, part of our students' workflow, but part of our workflow as well. So I think the thing I think I would want to start by saying and offering advice to educators and my fellow educators, as I too am currently wrestling with what my policy is going to look like, is it can't be anything that talks about AI across the board. We have to be more careful in saying things like, you can't use a large language model to craft your entire essay, but you can use AI enabled tools to check your grammar or your spelling or your prose. And maybe that's not your policy, but I think that getting that more fine grained is going to be a lot more helpful both to our students and clarify what we expect of them, but also helpful for us as we think through what tools we are going to allow and what tools maybe we aren't.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that as part of a first step. And, I also have said to my students, I'll be totally honest with you. Like, I don't know how to deal with this. And none of my colleagues do either
That's right. I think that's the honest thing to say.
because it's really new, it's really transformative. It's going to take time for us to figure out what are its possibilities, good and bad. And I think it's also true about how everyone's feeling about these new tools. So why don't we kind of zoom out with a view to looking at your book and just start with the first kind of big question, which is why philosophy? How can philosophy help people think through sort of the promise and perils of AI? It's intuitive for you and I, and probably a
Sure.
number of people listening to the podcast. But a lot of people might say, well, this is about computer science and software engineering, and and maybe political regulation and all that kind of stuff. So why philosophy?
Yeah, I think two reasons. So the first is that AI, unlike other inventions, or at least unlike to a certain degree, makes us ask these questions about human nature and human intelligence and human understanding and human consciousness that we just have never really asked before with other technologies. So certainly not with something like the printing press, which was, a groundbreaking society changing technology in its day. So nothing against these other technologies, but we don't look at the printing press and wonder, is this conscious or is what it's doing actually intelligent? It's clear the answer is no. Same thing even with other internet-based applications. We don't look at them and think, this kind of seems like a human behind the scenes, right? Whereas with AI, we all of a sudden, in a very pressing way, are confronted with these kinds of questions. And I would say it's an outlier perspective that looks at an AI and genuinely wonders, is this thing a human? I take it most people don't have that question, but a lot of us do sort of have this uncanny valley moment where we look at what ChatGPT can do and think, that sure looks a lot like what my undergrads can do, or that sure looks a lot like, oh no, what I can do in my better moments, or oh no, that looks like the sort of thing I thought was the distinct realm of humans, where now it sure looks like a machine can do it. So we have these questions that I think really haven't been asked in a serious way with other technologies that we are asking about AI. And the first reason I think philosophy can be really helpful here is that philosophy has a long history of thinking about all these questions in a really high degree of sophistication. What's a human being? What's consciousness? What's intelligence? It's not like these are questions we have to start from scratch and start thinking about. It's questions that philosophers have thought about for a long time. So we can bring those resources to bear as we think through it. I'll just touch on two other areas really quickly,
Yeah.
and we can talk about those more if you want to. Two is the ethical angle. So obviously, AI raises all sorts of ethical questions, and we can talk about those more. Philosophy, of course, one of the branches that we work in is ethics. So ethicists have a lot to say here. Now, are they going to have to educate themselves and learn some new things? Well, sure they are. It's a new technology. There's going to be different questions. They're going to come up in different ways. But are they at bedrock going to often come down to the same sorts of questions about what's a good human life? What does ethical action look like? What does good social action look like? I think yes. So I think ethicists have that to bring. Um, yeah, I would say those are the areas where I think philosophy has a lot to bring. I think there's other areas too, but we can start out with those two.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, why don't we focus on sort of the mind consciousness angle, more the kind of metaphysical or anthropological angle, because that's the one that you focus on
Yeah.
the most in the book. And I think that, to me, that's the real contribution you're making here is you're pushing back against what you see as bogus views of what the mind is and how those are a function of bogus views of what a human being is. So why don't we dive into that? You talk about first. Let's start with functionalism, I'll just kind of give the listeners a broad overview. Is what's wrong with our thinking about AI is a bogus view of the mind, and that's a function of a bogus view of the human being. So maybe that's an arc we can kind of trace. But let's start with functionalism. You say this is the sort of default view of the mind nowadays. So what is functionalism first of all?
Yeah, so functionalism, it really is the default, not only in our common ways of perceiving the mind, but it's one of the default. It's, there's never total consensus in the academy, but in the cognitive sciences and in philosophy of mind, it's still a majority view. So it's not that everyone's a functionalist, but a lot of people are still functionalists. And roughly what functionalism claims, and you can see already why this is setting us up for some problems when confronted with AI, is that the human mind works like a computer, right? And if you can, there's actually a really interesting historical argument to be made here that I don't go into much in the book. But it's not coincidence that the rise of computer science happens alongside functionalism. As we're figuring out computation, we're also saying, hey, we're building these things. Maybe this is a good way to understand the way we work too. And then all of a sudden you get these two ways of thinking collapsing into each other. But roughly what functionalism says, number one, is that we're like a computer. And what does it mean to say that we're like a computer? It means that human cognitive life can be captured by the functions that we perform, right? So you can think about the functions that your computer performs, and what it means to be a computer means that if you give a certain input into the computer, it will give you a certain output, right? So a well-running computer is one that responds when I type on it. We're on Zoom right now, right? That I can see you, that it's functioning well, that the right input is leading to the right kinds of outputs. And the functionalist says we can understand the human mind in the exact same kind of way. So what is, for instance, pain? Well, what pain is essentially is the way in which we correlate a certain set of inputs. So think about all the things that you could input to cause pain: pinpricks, pounding your thumb with a hammer, dropping a giant stack of books on your toe, falling off a ladder, right? We can make this giant list. And that pain is the thing that correlates that set of inputs to certain sets of outputs. Yelling out, crying, saying things like I'm in pain, right? And the functionalist wants to say what the human mind is nothing more than that function that we carry out. So that once you've gotten the inputs mapped to outputs, don't ask, well, where's the human mind or where's consciousness in all this? That's the whole story. That's all there is to it. The human mind, in short, is kind of like a computer.
Mm-hmm.
So I can go on. I don't want to turn this into just like a monologue, Dave. So if you want to
Yeah,
jump in.
yeah. Well, one thing I wrote down in the margins while I was reading the book was Hobbes. I met a computer scientist at my university years ago, and he was interested in collaborating on some projects. And he says, yeah, he says, some people actually think that Thomas Hobbes was the founder of computer science because
Wow.
he advances this view of human mind and behavior, that it's just external stimuli of the environment. And then like that, leads to reactions in our nerves. And then that leads us to move our muscles in a certain way, and it leads to a behavioral output. So I thought it was very powerful, in part because
It
Hobbes
is.
was such a founding father of sorts of modern political thought.
It's
Uh,
really interesting. Yeah.
and
I never heard the Hobbes connection, but I totally buy that.
yeah, and kind of scientific thought as well, because he was, had a very close relationship with Francis Bacon. So I'm always interested in how the ways in which science and technology have come to dominate modern life, and they're downstream of these philosophers who lay down these views of
Exactly.
mind and human nature. Uh, so functionalism, dominant view of mind. What
Functionalism's dominant view of mind.
what's
Um,
misguided in it?
yeah. So I think what's misguided, there's a few things really that are misguided. One that I lean into the book that I think is a really important one that in some ways is just very obvious. And obviously there's controversy around this, and philosophers listening are not going to be convinced by these arguments. But I think that it is the sort of thing that is the thing that functionalists really have to grapple with. And that's the fact that many of our cognitive processes are very obviously embodied in a certain way. So I like to give the example, and again, this is one that I use with my undergrads. I'm sure a dyed-in-the-wool functionalist who's listening to this is not going to be convinced by it, right? They have things to say. But whenever I'm teaching this to my undergrads, I like to talk about my students who are dancers or who are athletes or who are musicians. And I'll ask them, when you are dancing in the ballet, or when you're running an arpeggio on your guitar, or when you're going in for a layup, are you thinking in terms of inputs and outputs? Are you doing something cognitive kind of between your ears or computationally? And their answer is always, well, of course not. And in fact, if I do that, I miss the shot, or I stumble in the dance, or I fail to play the arpeggio in the way I was trying to. Rather, when I complete those tasks, I have to do them with my body. I can actually speak to this from the inverse, because whenever I try to dance, I do think through it computationally, right? I think, okay, Joe, you're at a wedding, you got to dance. Now you should move this foot. Now you should move that foot. And things fall apart very rapidly, right? Because if you do that with those sorts of activities, if you try and disembody them, they don't turn out to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the functionalist has a hard time grappling with this, because if you're a functionalist, what the mind is just the inputs and outputs. It's just the computational factor. So the fact that there's certain parts of our cognitive lives, and dance is highly cognitive, musicianship is highly cognitive, even athletics are highly cognitive in maybe a little different way, but still highly cognitive. And yet, if we take the body out of the equation, it's clear that those activities just totally fall apart. So one thing I really like pressing the functionalists on is to account for why the body is such an important part of our cognition, and how understanding the mind in purely computational terms is often sidelining the body or leaving it out altogether.
Yeah. And you mentioned also, in addition to embodiment, is just consciousness, consciousness, conscious experience. We take to be an essential aspect of what a mind is, and functionalism doesn't account for that.
That's right. That's right. And this is, of course, if anyone's heard of philosophical zombies or arguments from zombies. These are arguments that Dave Chalmers really is the one who was responsible for making these famous. And the idea is roughly we can imagine beings that are functionally identical to us, right? Who carry out all the same activities, who correlate inputs and outputs in the same way, but who lack conscious experience, right? You can kind of think about this in terms of it's almost like a matrix sort of scenario where you, or it's a very, I mean, in a way, it's Descartes all over again, where I can look at the people around me and notice that they're acting in human-like ways, but I can still ask the question, but are the lights actually on upstairs, right? Or is it just me? It's kind of this argument from solipsism.
Yeah.
And what this argument's supposed to do, according to Chalmers, is to suggest that even after you've accounted for all the functional, computational like things that human beings do, there still is this question of consciousness. And the fact that that question remains suggests that consciousness is not captured purely in computational terms. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't talk about this in the book, but I actually think that the question of consciousness and the question of embodiment are not different challenges to functionalism, but the same challenge to functionalism. I think that once you have accounted for embodiment sufficiently, you actually don't have the zombies problem anymore either. That's sort of an argument for another day, but I think that the functional understanding, all the things it misses out on are related to each other. So once you add back in embodiment, once you add back in our social nature and all these other things that functionalists wanted to eliminate, that you end up getting back consciousness and all these other sorts of things as well.
Yeah. I think I can see that connection, and let me just sketch this out and see if that makes sense to you. Because one argument you illustrate against functionalism is just the fact that we have imaginations. So even imagining the zombie scenario, the fact that we need to use our imagination in order to even entertain that possibility. The fact that we use metaphor, and even with the simulation hypothesis that you describe in the book, sort of modern day facelift of Descartes'
exactly
skeptical argument in the Meditations. It's the fact that we can even raise the question about reality versus simulation, about conscious beings versus zombie beings. That is in some way a clue that there must be something real about embodiment, consciousness, something essential to the mind about consciousness and embodiment.
Exactly. And I think this list of things that we're making. So again, you start out with this very computational understanding of the human mind. And I'm not one to deny, and I take it hardly anyone is going to be able to deny that part of human psychology is computational. It's just clear that's part of how our psychology works. But you start adding in all these things that account leaves out. So we've talked about embodiment. We've talked about consciousness. You were talking about, I would categorize some of what you were just talking about, Dave, under the broad category of meaning, right? So metaphor, analogy, understanding that things mean something. It's not a coincidence at all that those are exactly the pressure points when we start looking at AI and thinking about, does it have all those things? And I think that once you make this connection, AI becomes, in some ways, much more disappointing in that these giant questions that we initially might be tempted to ask actually end up being pretty obviously not that good of questions to begin with, right? So we ask things like, is there any meaning behind this thing that the AI is producing? Is it, is it really a poem? Is it really intelligent? Could it be conscious? And I think that once you've made the connection that actually those questions only come out of a tradition that understands human intelligence to be computational, that we start to be worried about them because we see a really, really good computer, right? So it makes sense to start having those questions. But if we look at that theory of mind and see its limitations, we notice that those are limitations that are kind of the pressure points in a lot of these AI conversations. And we're able to say, oh, wait, like, no, like, why would I think it's conscious unless I already had adopted a functionalist framework of mind? So maybe my problem here isn't with AI, even though that's the way it sure looked like. Rather, the real questions I need to be asking are, what's my theory of the human person that's channeling into these questions I have about AI? And depending where you land there, right, you might look at those questions and realize, oh, I am a functionalist. Well, then those questions about AI might actually be more pressing. But part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to say, there's actually other good theories of mind that then when you have those solidified and you turn to questions about AI, you realize, oh, I kind of can answer these pretty easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious then, do you think a lot of the super powerful people who are AI boosters, some of whom are, worried about Terminator-like scenarios of super intelligence, run amok, uh, that we don't need to worry about those concerns because they're products of an inaccurate view of what the mind is and therefore what the capacities of artificial intelligence might be.
Yeah, exactly. I think it at least changes the nature of the conversation. So instead of us worrying about us creating a being that's super intelligent or creating a being that all of a sudden we owe things to or that has rights or sort of some of these questions like you said, some of the big mover and shakers have been talking about. I think it pivots us instead to ask where I think our attention really should be at, which is about the ethics of implementation of AI, the place where we started, like how do educators and people in think tanks and people in business and in banking and in secondary education, I mean, basically any sector, think about where is appropriate use, where is inappropriate use, how do I guide people I'm trying to guide through this era? What do we demand from companies that are developing these products to have in terms of transparency? And these are the kinds of questions that are the kinds of questions we ask about things, not about people, right? It's the sorts of questions we ask and should ask about social media and the internet and printing presses and other tools that we adopt. So I think that it doesn't necessarily deflate the urgency of conversations around AI. It rather changes their nature from being existential in a certain way to
Yeah.
being more, this is a new technology that's going to change a lot of things. Like, how and when and if should we adopt this and use it as a society and as individuals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, you tell the story in the book of the engineer at Google who was fired because he publicly, declared that he thought that the program he was interacting with was sentient. And I'm curious what do you think is the source of the temptation to project sentience or consciousness onto machines?
Yeah, I think what I really like that episode, I think it's a helpful one to reflect on. So the guy's name is Blake Lemoine. Your listeners can Google him. Hasn't been in the news as much the last couple of years, but like 2 years ago, like 2021 or so, the dude was everywhere. And I think what I like about that episode is go and watch some clips. Is near everyone portrays Blake as a total loony, right? Like the headline is always not quite this bad, but something like wackadoodle Google engineer says that AI is sentient, right? It's something like that. Where when you actually listen to Blake talk and go and listen to the interviews and notice the disconnect between these dumbfounded reporters, right? How on earth could you think this? And what he's able to do is carefully walk you through, here's why I came to the conclusions that I came to. And what I think is that Blake is actually not a loony or an outlier. And that the reason that that got so much press in some ways is that it was an emperor's new clothes moment where he was able to show, here's what all you guys actually think about the human mind. Here's sort of the cultural understanding of what the human mind is something purely computational. And here's where that leads is you kind of have to say some of this stuff is sentient or conscious, or at least you've got to ask those questions because it's computationally getting really close to what human beings are capable of performing. And I think that there's this moment of panic where, I mean, I'm psychologizing this a little bit for you. So, but I think part of what was going on with that moment was people realizing we've got to shut this guy down. We've got to sort of portray him as a loony because it's scary to realize that the dominant anthropology actually does lead to those conclusions.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my, again, kind of an overly psychologizing diagnosis, but I think that's kind of what was going on with that episode is
No,
Blake
no,
was the
no.
guy who actually was able to tease out and say, here's what you guys all, it's sort of like the equivalent of the physical, it's almost like a Nietzschean moment in some ways, right? No, we've killed God. Like this is actually what follows, guys. And everyone gets really scared. So like, no, we don't want to go there. And I think that was a little bit of Blake where he's like, y'all thought we're just computers. Well, here's what you got to say about all these computers that are really intelligent. And they're like, no, we don't want to go there. So I actually think he's a really helpful figure for that reason.
And it's often it's those like very like right-brained, hard-headed engineer or left brain, I'm sorry, engineering types who have that reaction, and you might say irrational reaction. And I don't think that psychologizing is out of place at all. And in fact, I suspect that it's crucial for understanding what's misguided in our thinking about AI, particularly like psychodynamics and unconscious. I think that's exactly right. He was giving an individual voice to, you might say, the collective shadow
Exactly.
of our thinking about mind, uh,
Exactly.
that
Exactly.
we don't want to face, and that freaks us out if it's really made clear to us and visible and public.
Exactly. But I think the good part about this, and this is what I really wanted to try and do with my book, is to argue that we needn't be this freaked out because in fact we don't have to accept that dominant narrative about what the human mind is. There are other options available at which we don't have to reach Blake's conclusions. So sort of a moment of saying, you don't like these conclusions, you don't have to dismiss them as a loony. You rather have to go back and actually be very careful and look at your human anthropology and your human understanding of the mind and see, are there other options available that are going to be more resilient in the face of these questions about AI. So I actually think it's a great opportunity for philosophers because we're trained in thinking about these things that we can say these questions we're asking about AI. Again, I think this actually goes across the board, whether it's the big anthropological questions about who we are as humans and intelligence, all the way down to the how should I use this and how should I incorporate this or not incorporate into our life. Those are questions that philosophers are really good at asking and answering questions to. So I think
Yeah,
it's a great moment for us to step in and say, hey guys, this argument you're having over here, or these questions you're having over here, great questions, but here's what's really going on under the surface. And let me do a little bit of work to provide some clarity.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's one thing that I like in the book too, is you center the discussion of anthropology, and that functionalism, uh, the term might be new, but it's really derivative of a much older and really ancient view of human nature, of Gnosticism, which we'll pivot to in a moment.
Good.
But one thing I just want to point out is I think it's a really important thing you mentioned, is that we tend to think of artificial intelligence and cognitive science, and neuroscience, and this sort of scientific jargon as secular. But a lot of these views are not modern. They're ancient and they're religious in character. So, can you tell us about how functionalism is in some ways derivative, or connected with Gnosticism, and what Gnosticism is for listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So Gnosticism, um, and this is depending on the nature of your listeners. This could be an overly reductive account of Gnosticism. So it's a complex movement that it sort of is most famous for being an early heresy that the church, the early Christian church, had pointed out and said, this is not what we, because they were making claims about the nature of Christ and things like that. But it's really a wider movement than that. It was sort of Christian adjacent for a while, but that's not the only thing it was. Um, what I pinpoint in the book as sort of a unifying feature of Gnosticism, and again, there's a lot of extra stuff on top that we could talk about, but I think the one that's most relevant is this idea that the body is not particularly important, right? So this could be something close to full-blown Platonism, where who I really am is something immaterial. It could be something a little bit less than that, and depends on which Gnostic you're talking about. But all Gnostics have this tendency to disassociate human nature from human embodiment. Okay. So there's Gnosticism. And like you said, and this is actually something, I mean, I'd be interested to hear your take, or we could kind of spitball on it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that Gnosticism was distinctively a philosophical, religious way of thinking about the world, right? So this wasn't just like a dry, I don't know, it wasn't like being a trope theorist or a universalist or some like weird philosophical abstract position. It was very much a way of life that was tied to religious beliefs, that was tied to sort of a whole network of ways of being.
Eating habits.
Eating habits. It's
very aesthetic.
Very aesthetic, yeah.
Sexuality, and the body is corrupting, and as kind of vile and wretched and gross.
Exactly.
You need to sort of detach from it as much as possible.
Yeah, the term, it really is, it's more helpful to think about Gnosticism as closer to saying something like Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism, where it's a set of beliefs, yes, but it's also a set of practices, and it's a religious tradition, and it's got theological sorts of commitments. And there is this central teaching that the human body is corruptible and kind of gross, and we've got to get rid of it in some way or another, right? So that's
something to escape from.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's historical Gnosticism. What I draw a connection to in the book is the functionalist idea. And it's a tricky pivot here, because functionalism is not a religion. Functionalism is an academic position, or at least that's what it says it is. And I think you're right, Dave, to say there actually maybe is more going on here than what initially seems to be. But no one goes to the church of functionalism, right? It's not that kind of organized tradition, and there aren't dietary habits associated with being a functionalist. So it at least falls under the purview of being an academic theory. But it's interesting that one of the ways of talking about functionalism is to say that matter doesn't matter.
Yeah,
that's kind of cute.
I love this phrase you used in the book. Yeah,
it's a great phrase. And what it's trying to point out is that maybe the helpful way of thinking about this is that if you're a functionalist, the human mind is kind of like computer software. And when it comes to computer software, the exact nature of the computer you're running it on doesn't really matter, right? What matters is that the inputs and outputs work as they do, that it functions properly. But as long as it's functioning properly, it could be on an Apple or a PC or an old PC or a desktop or a phone or a tablet. Doesn't really matter, right? The matter doesn't matter. In fact, and this is something that's underappreciated, I think, sometimes about functionalism. Functionalism is actually consistent with a purely immaterial view of reality. So you can be a functionalist and say, actually, not only doesn't the matter, but you don't need matter at all, right? You could have something immaterial that's carrying out the functions of the human mind, and that would count as a human mind as well. So because of this sort of flight from the material in a way that's more philosophical than religious when it comes to functionalism, but I really want to say that there's parallels between these ways of thinking, in that what both are ultimately trying to do is to distance our human nature from our human embodiment in different ways and with different cultural and religious associations that are associated with traditions, but both are ultimately unified in this trajectory of a flight from the body. And I think it's when we start flying from the human body that these questions about AI become much more difficult to answer. Whereas when we start coming back to the human body, I think that all of a sudden, in some ways, it becomes obvious that no matter how, even if we do have a theory that says artificial intelligence is intelligent in some way, it can't be the same intelligence as us because look at it, right? It's embodied, but it's on a server, right? It's like that's about as different from a human body as you can get. Um, so I want to say that sort of a lot of our questions that we have about AI now are actually symptomatic of latent Gnosticism that many of us still hold on to. And that we've got to go and kind of eradicate the little Gnostic in all of us. And if we do that, questions about AI will still be difficult, but be less existentially fraught than if we take that Gnostic baggage with us.
Yeah. Ooh, our own inner Gnostic, the little Gnostic within us.
That's right. That's right.
I was thinking about that while reading the text about not, you might say, like the psychology of Gnosticism. Why is it a resilient view, and maybe particularly tempting in our, I don't want to say our technological era because every era is technological, but our era of high technology. Nietzsche wrote that the religion of modernity is comfortableness.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
And there's a contemporary writer, I believe this is from N.S. Lyons, who has this. He says, we live in an era of fully automated luxury Gnosticism.
I love that.
And there's something about the ideal of frictionless environments they talk about in Silicon Valley often that seems to reflect this idea that if we can just remove all limitations and sources of resistance, then we would be free. Then that would be an improved condition. So there's all sorts of ways I can see this as Gnostic. And you quote Pope Francis toward the end of the book, talking about one of the deficiencies in a way of thinking about human nature that prefers sort of the unlimited or the infinite range of possibilities to the limited and finite possibilities. So maybe as a way of moving toward your positive view, which we called embodiment plus, what's a more attractive view to for thinking about human nature and therefore of AI?
Yeah. No, there's a lot of great stuff there. I think I want to start with this idea of why the perennial allure of Gnosticism, because I think you're right. It's very alluring, and I think we see it once you have a label for it, you start to see it everywhere. Not only in the titans of Silicon Valley, but in our own psychology, we see that we would prefer to run from our bodies in many ways. You might notice I'm getting over a cold right now. Got a little catch in my voice. Bodies are inconvenient, right? They get sick. I'm gonna sit down to record a podcast with my old buddy, and I'm like, man, like why do I have to have a catch in my throat right now? And I mean, I think it's cooperating right now, right? But these things, our body's always getting in the way. I actually turned 40 in 3 days, very
Oh,
soon.
wow.
Yeah. And the old body's starting to feel 40. It's like, oh, I can't do that anymore. Like, oh man, like I didn't know like just lying funny could lead to like a week of back pain.
The 40s make Gnostics of us all.
Exactly. No, that's a quotable line right there. Yeah, we would in many ways prefer not to have these messy bodies of ours. So I think that's a big part of the allure of Gnosticism is, man, like it would be nice not to be entangled with all this finite bodily stuff and to be something infinite or something at least disembodied. It's actually interesting. So I am coming from a Catholic tradition, and it's interesting how much this even takes hold in my tradition, which historically is and always has been a very embodied one, right? So as a Catholic, I go to Mass, and every week I say the creed, which ends with this belief in the resurrection of the body, right? So our hopes for an afterlife, and implicit in that, our anthropology is humans are bodies. Now we think we're more than that too, but it's like, no, like what you are is a body. And yet I can't tell you how many of my students And just how many Catholics I talk with generally who are just dumbfounded by, right? Like they sort of think that what we are is this immaterial spirit, and that's what Christians are supposed to believe. Um, Whereas at least the Catholic tradition has always been adamant that no, like your body, that's who you are.
The
Um,
incarnation is kind of the whole point. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, why would God become a human? What about this whole like sacrament? Anyways, it goes very deep into Catholic understanding, but a lot of even Catholics totally miss it. So I say that in part just to make good on your point, Dave, that I think Gnosticism is hugely tempting, even for people who are part of a tradition that ostensibly believe that Gnosticism is wrong. And I think that's a big part of it, is that it's embarrassing and inconvenient and seemingly unfortunate that what we are is our bodies. Um, but yeah, so I mean, what I want to do in the book though is to point people away from that Gnostic view and towards a more embodied one. And why do I want to do that? I mean, I think the main reason as a philosopher is because I think it's true. I think that's always a good reason to point people to something, is that no, I think that even if Gnosticism would be nice, it's false. So here's the true theory. But I actually also think that this flight from our bodies misses out on what we are to begin with. Um, I think I talk about this in the book, but I'm not 100%. Do I talk about angels in the book?
Very briefly.
Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit more about angels, right? So angels, the way Catholics understand them, are these purely immaterial beings. And they're similar to humans in some ways. They have an intellect. They're not similar in other ways, right? They have perfect intellect, so they can know things right away. But importantly, they're disembodied. And I think sometimes the Gnostic tendency. So this doesn't matter if you or your listeners or anyone believes in any of that stuff, right? So you don't like the point of the angels isn't like I want you all to believe in angels. I think it would be. I believe in angels, but that's not the point of this comment. Is that I think a big part of the Gnostic tendency is us wanting to be angelic, right? We see that and we think, oh man, a perfect intellect, no body, all powerful, like that looks sweet. But going back a long ways, and I'm especially influenced by Aristotle here, to be happy as anything or to be virtuous as anything, we have to come to grips with and live out our nature as we really are. So if Aristotle gets this right, and what a flourishing human being is a human being that is fully human, then us trying to be angels, even though that looks like it would be a pretty sweet life, actually isn't going to lead to happiness, at least in this deep sense that Aristotle wants to talk about it. Why? Because we're attempting to live according to a nature that just isn't ours. So it's not just a matter of, I think it's true. I do. It's not just a matter of, I think there's good arguments against that way of understanding ourselves. I think there are. It's also that ultimately, I think that the only way we flourish as humans is to understand and then live with what it means to be a human being in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And on that note, uh, I take it part of what you're trying to do in the book is help us see not just why we shouldn't think that AI is conscious or sentient, but that an uncritical way of relating to it can compromise our own humanity.
Exactly.
And you talk
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
the end. Oh, go ahead. You were gonna.
No, no, no. I was going to say, so the title of the book is Staying Human in an Era of AI. And part of that has to do with how can we act ethically and how can we integrate it in our lives. And I think those are hugely important questions. But in some ways, my bigger worry is that we really do end up equating ourselves with the machines that we've created. And in doing so, lose sight of who we are. So we sort of I'm worried that we ask some of these existentially fraught questions because we've already lost sight of who we are as humans. So that's hence the staying human, right? It's sort of, I think, a checkpoint for us to say, whoa, wait, like, is that all we are, or are we something more than that? And let's do some more thinking about who we are to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, in that note, do you think that it could be uh, Hegel has this phrase that the cunning of reason? sort of reason, the world historical spirit uses unlikely instruments to help advance sort of the development of human consciousness, uh, maybe far from being a threat, could AI almost be like an awakening device because it throws us back upon ourselves precisely because of what you said at the beginning of the conversation, that it's unlike other technologies because it's reflexive in a way, because it's about intelligence, and that forces us to ask, what is intelligence? How is our intelligence different from that? And so in some ways, that way it could be a useful tool for everyone, and maybe especially within education.
Yeah.
So maybe we could pivot back to that. How have you? Because I know you write about these things, you research them, you think about them a lot. I'm sure you teach about them a lot.
I do.
How do you use AI and kind of technology more broadly? I know you've written on transhumanism as
Yeah.
well. How do you bring these things into the classroom to stimulate philosophical reflection?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I actually I'm on the exact same page as you. I think it is a real, I forget the language you use, but it's an opportunity. It's a moment for philosophers to really step in and show what our training and our discipline has to offer. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here. We both think that philosophy has lots to offer in any era because it's asking the most fundamental questions. But I think that it's one of these moments at which we as a whole are stopping and thinking about philosophical questions in a way with more urgency than at other times. So that's really the way that I approach this in my teaching. And as soon as anyone outside of teaching learns I work on this stuff, they all want to talk about it too. And I really do see that as an opportunity, right? Is that I remember um well there was, now I'm going to forget his name, but there was a scholar when I was at University of Chicago. So I'll just attribute this anonymously, even though it's a just my almost 40-year-old brain forgetting who it was exactly. I remember he said whenever he introduced himself as a philosopher to somebody on the train, they looked at him as if he had said, "I'm a magician," and slowly scooted away. And I'm sure that we both had these experiences where you're out hanging out with friends and mixed company, and it's sort of people don't know what you do, and it comes up, what do you do? And I teach philosophy, and the eyebrows raise, and there's like a slow backing away or a slow like look of suspicion.
Or they conflate it with psychology.
Exactly. Or they conflate it with psychology. Um, where now for the last year, especially if I follow it up with, I'm a philosopher who works on AI, instead of backing away, they scoop more close because they want to ask these questions, right? Is, oh, do you think it's conscious? Do you think they're going to take over? Um, can I use it? Right? They say, good questions. We have an in. Um,
And
I
if by they you mean Mark Andreessen and Sam Altman and company, oh, absolutely, they'll take.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You have a spot at your company that I could step into. Um, yeah, but I find that students have these questions as well. So I find that students are part of the general population, and they, like everyone else, has these questions about what's acceptable use, what to make of this thing. It doesn't seem like a human to me, but I don't quite know why it doesn't count. So I think those are great starting points to ask the questions that philosophers have really always wondered about and always talked about. Maybe not all the questions, but what's the nature of a human? What's the nature of free will? What's consciousness? How do I act well? How do I act well in relationship to others? What does a good human life look like? I really think AI, and this is why I'm so excited about it, and I think that it's good that it's kind of having a cultural moment, is I think that it does really raise all those issues in pressing ways. And it gives us as a philosophers to an opportunity to look at those questions and see how both we might approach them, but also how the philosophical tradition might approach them, what we think is going well with the way people are asking those questions, where we think maybe could refine them a little bit. And I think because there's that intrinsic interest there and excitement there, I think it's a really great opportunity for us.
mm, yeah, one thing that you mentioned in the book a number of times is you encourage the reader to trust their gut. And I get the sense kind of that the embodied plus view is really kind of closer to common sense. I think it was Winston Churchill said after reading, the Nicomachean Ethics, he was like, "Oh yeah, this is just common sense." Like, duh. However, I also suspect that, people talk a lot about the collapse of common sense nowadays. I'm wondering if you think that the way in which incorrect, disembodied views of human nature, as embedded in our technological devices, is maybe one sense common sense is being eroded, the ubiquity of these devices, because they almost lead us to forget ourselves. And we gradually, maybe we might not say theoretically we agree with, functionalism or Gnosticism or what have you, but practically in terms of how we live, because we are, you know, engaging with these devices so much that are, premised on an incorrect view of the human being. And so by using them, do we kind of gradually start to live out that disembodied way of being that, as you point out in the book, can lead to anxiety, depression, loneliness. I know this is starting to veer into the Jonathan Haidt thesis that you're probably familiar with, of how he blames phones and social media. But I think they're probably, to some extent, the same ball of wax, in terms of devices that encode a particular view of human nature that is not conducive to our flourishing. And it's happening at scale. So there's a few questions buried in there.
Yeah, I think it's great.
You're
I mean,
so
I think in a way it's pointing out that we are at a crucial moment. So I think we're at a moment right now in which our thinking about ourselves and our practices don't quite line up.
yeah,
Where
bingo.
we act in our technological spaces as if we're pure spirits. Even right now, honestly, right? We kind of are. We're I'm in Chicago. I take it in Boston, right? We're staring at each other in screens, and so much of our lives are spent on our devices, where we may as well be computers. We may as well be entirely disembodied. So our practices are Gnostic in many ways, and increasingly more Gnostic, right? We are held in sway by the power of corporations and the algorithm, right? My desires are shaped by my browsing habits. This is a lot of the Haidt stuff, right? Jonathan Haidt is, yeah, I mean, my self-understanding is shaped by my feeds on social media. My desires are shaped by those feeds on social media. What I think about others is shaped by technology. So we live out our lives in many ways affirming the Gnostic thesis. But at the same time, we know there's more to being human than all of that, right? We know that it's more real if we were able to be sitting at our desk right now and having a conversation and going out for a beer afterwards. It's more real. We both taught through COVID, right? It's more real to have students in person than on Zoom. It's more real to have real friends than social media friends, and so on. So I think that, again, this is common sense. All of us know this, but I think we're at this pivotal moment in which we kind of nod along and say, "Oh yeah, I know all that, and now I live my life as if I didn't know that." And I think AI is providing us with this really nice opportunity to realize we had best stop and check in before we get so far away from who we are that we've forgotten that second part. So right now, I think we're in a moment of tension, but I think that if we don't correct in some ways, and again, what that looks like could be a whole bunch of different things. And I'm not a technology naysayer, right? I think I actually really like playing around with AI. I'm going to try and find ways to incorporate it into my workflow. I think it's really nice that we're able to do this over Zoom and actually make
Yeah.
it happen. But at the same time, that we are aware of the way in which our practices and our nature have disconnected in some ways, and making sure that our level our plane of analysis goes from our nature to the practice, and saying this is great, Dave, but it would have been better if we could have been together. Then the other direction and saying, oh, I got to hang out with my friend Dave today. So that must be really all that I am at the end of the day, right? So I think right now we're still kind of evaluating our practices based on our nature. But I worry that we could flip that, where all of a sudden we start understanding our nature based on our practices.
Yeah. Yeah. You write in the final paragraph of the book, we stay human in an era of AI the same way we stayed human in previous eras. We must recognize our humanity. Um, and I like that framing that you just articulated a little because it shows that in a way the problem's not totally unique. Because the problem of the disconnection between like what we like our walk and our talk, or our walk and our self-talk is as old as humanity. Um, when Jesus talks about hypocrites, right? We're all hypocrites.
Yeah, we are.
We're all actors, and that disconnect between our action and our thinking uh, is a chronic human problem. And Heidegger says in Question Concerning Technology, where the danger is, the saving power grows. So there's always this potential that the technology can threaten us, it has the risk of us forgetting ourselves, but it also is the opportunity to remember ourselves because it kind of throws the problem in our face. So I quite like that, and I wanted to ask as a way of kind of wrapping up. I saw that you also teach a course on, is it science fiction and philosophy?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I'm thinking about this a lot too. I've done a little bit of that myself, and when I teach my course on, I call it Playing God,
Cool.
technology and the human condition, and we start by reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein,
That's great.
and the students love it, and they're amazed at how good it is, but also how, as a sort of modern mythology, it's a good device for thinking about our devices. So I'm curious, how have you know, found using fiction useful in helping people think through these contemporary dilemmas, whether it's genetic engineering or artificial intelligence, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I co-teach this class with a biologist. So we have a lot of fun together because we try and do a interdisciplinary thing. And I think both of us, what we really like about framing the class with science fiction novels is it allows a picture of things broadly construed to get blown up really big, right? So here's these questions about AI. Let's fast forward 200 years and here's one way things could be, right? Or here's genetic engineering. And here's 50 years from now, here's one way things could turn out. Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake is great for this. If you highly recommend the book. What's cool about that framing is it number one, it does. So I'm an analytically trained philosopher, so I was trained on doing thought experiments and things, and I still have a soft spot in my heart for thought experiments. But I've also come to appreciate how limited thought experiments can be because they bracket so many things. When you read a full novel like Frankenstein, it sort of fills in all those gaps that you'd want in a good thought experiment. So it gives you a much more robust place to start than just a couple paragraphs about Smith and Jones or whatever your characters are in a thought experiment.
Yeah.
Um, the other reason though is that I think it takes certain theses or hypotheses or ways of thinking about the human or scientific discoveries and projects out in a way that then lets us do exactly what you just mentioned, that then reflects back on ourselves. So we can say, oh, wait, like we're having these questions about artificial intelligence now, but what if, this is going to date me, what if Data from Star Trek was walking around, right? I mean, I grew up on Star Trek Next Generation. It's like, well, what if like I was buddies with an android? Like that's kind of the way things are heading. And does that change things? And honestly, we've been talking the whole time about how I think these questions about artificial intelligence in some ways are misguided. Man, I would have been sad if they killed off data, right? So I like look at that and I'm like, well, I don't like, this is what why do I think that? Is it just misguided or am I missing something in this analysis? And I think it allows us to do that sort of thing where we, again, and kind of explode the current landscape in a way that makes it a little bit bigger, a little bit more salient, a little bit more pressing, maybe. And then we can look at that and think, oh, wait, like if I think this about this way of setting things out, then that actually teaches me something about what I think about in the moment. So I think that that's one thing that actually when I'm teaching, I do, you mentioned I talk about transhumanism and I'm writing now a lot about AI and I teach science fiction. One thing I emphasize to my students again and again is that the reason we focus on the future is not for the sake of the future. Maybe it is a little bit, but it's mostly for the sake of the present, right? Why do we read about future humans 100 years ago, years from now that have incorporated cybernetic features into themselves? Because it's pretty sweet. Well, yeah, that's one reason, right? And the nerd in me says, yeah, that's a great reason to do it. But also because it helps me reflect on, should I get a Neuralink? Is like wearing a Fitbit a form of being a cyborg? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Right. So I think it can be tempting for us, especially those of us that work on future problems,
Yeah.
to think like, oh, what I'm talking about is what if, or what happens, or what should we do when really the question is, no, 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 this is about right now. And we're talking about the future in order to understand human nature and ethics and the good life. And those are all things that are obviously not just in the future.
Yeah. Well, and to paraphrase and update William Gibson's famous adage, the science fiction writer, the future is here and it's more evenly distributed than when William Gibson first wrote that line. I think
Yeah,
it's one reason science fiction is becoming more popular and shifting out of sort of nerd space
it
and
is. I don't know
more.
what I feel about that, Dave, by the way. It's like part of me wants to like keep it to ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I want to let you go. I know you have another appointment to run to, but it was great connecting, just generally after all these years. And congrats on the book. And yeah, keep it up, and we'll see what other weird technologies come down the pike in the next few years that uh, will require you to write another book about them.
Yeah.
So
No,
thanks.
thanks a lot for having me on the podcast, Dave. And like you said, it was great just catching up and thanks for all the great questions. It was really fun to talk about this stuff.
Good, good. Yeah, and it's helpful for me as I craft my own syllabus for the semester around how I'm going to approach Chat GPT.
Cool, man. Let's
All
be in
right.
touch.
All right. Thanks, Joe. All right.